I accidentally opened an old bank account that I hadn't used for 10 years. There was $24 million in it. I had never seen that kind of money in my life. I immediately called the bank when I found out who had been depositing into the account. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video, and also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I never thought of myself as someone things happen to. I was the one who made things happen. I paid the bills on time, I kept the calendar, I remembered birthdays, car maintenance schedules, dentist appointments for 2 kids, and the exact date the furnace filter needed changing. I was the kind of woman who had a color-coded spreadsheet for the family grocery budget and still found time to bake something on Sunday mornings. That was my life. Steady, organized, a little unglamorous, but mine. My name is Margaret Collins. Most people call me Maggie. I'm 46 years old. I live in a 3-bedroom house in Oak Park, Illinois, about 12 miles west of downtown Chicago. I work as a senior accountant at a mid-sized logistics firm. I have 2 kids, Tyler, who's 22 and finishing grad school in Michigan, and Dana, who's 19 and studying nursing in Indianapolis. I raised them mostly on my own after the divorce. That part of the story comes later, but you already know there was a divorce. There's always a divorce when a story starts this way. For a long time, I had convinced myself that I was fine, and maybe I was. Fine in the way that a person is fine when they've simply gotten used to a certain amount of dull, background grief, the kind you don't talk about at work, the kind you press down with busyness and routine and the smell of coffee in the morning. The year before everything changed, I had started to notice small things, nothing dramatic, just little splinters under the surface. A mutual acquaintance mentioned, almost in passing, that Derek, my ex-husband, had recently bought a vacation home in Scottsdale, Arizona. I smiled and said something neutral, but I remember driving home afterward and feeling a strange, cold prickling at the back of my neck. Derek was a sales consultant, a decent one, sure, but not Scottsdale vacation home decent. Not when he'd told our divorce mediator a decade ago that he had no significant liquid assets. Then, 2 months after that, Tyler mentioned during a phone call that he'd run into Derek at a restaurant in Chicago. Tyler didn't say much. He and his father had a distant, polite relationship at best, but he mentioned offhand that Derek had been wearing a watch Tyler described as insane expensive. I let it go. I told myself people's fortunes changed. I told myself it wasn't my business anymore, but it nagged at me, the way things nag when they don't quite add up. It was a Wednesday in October when everything began. I remember the specific quality of the light that afternoon, gray and flat, the kind Chicago gets in mid-autumn when the sky can't decide if it wants to rain. I was working from home, going through a backlog of old financial documents I'd been meaning to organize for years. Tax files, old receipts, the kind of thing that accumulates in a shoebox and never quite makes it to the shredder. Somewhere in the 3rd box, between a 2009 car insurance renewal and a birthday card from my mother, I found an old envelope from a bank called First Meridian Financial. I almost threw it out without opening it. I didn't recognize the name at first. First Meridian had since been acquired by a larger bank and rebranded, but something made me stop. My name was on the envelope, my full legal name, Margaret Ann Collins. I opened it. It was an annual account summary dated 2014. I didn't remember opening an account with First Meridian. The balance listed was $847.32. Unremarkable. Forgettable. I set it aside. But later that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it, because I did not remember opening that account, and I had been a meticulous record keeper my entire adult life. I would have remembered. The next morning, I searched online and found that First Meridian had been absorbed by Great Lakes Federal Bank. I called their customer service line during my lunch break. I gave my name, my social security number, my old address. There was a pause on the line. Then the representative said carefully, "Miss Collins, I'm showing a linked account in your name that has been active. Would you like me to confirm the current balance?" "Yes," I said. "Please." There was another pause. "The current balance," she said, "is $24,312,000. I sat down. I was already sitting, but somehow I sat down harder, as if my body needed to re-establish contact with something solid. Outside my window, a neighbor was raking leaves. The sound was perfectly ordinary. Everything was perfectly ordinary except for the number still vibrating in my ears. $24 million. In an account I did not remember opening, with my name on it. I called the bank back 20 minutes later to make sure I hadn't misheard. I hadn't. I didn't sleep that night. Not a single hour. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while the radiator clicked and the street outside was quiet, and I went over the same thoughts in circles, the way you do when your brain refuses to stop pulling at a thread. $24 million, my name, an account I hadn't opened. Or had I? Could I have simply forgotten? No. No, I couldn't have. I was an accountant. I tracked every account I'd ever held in a master document. I had done this since I was 23 years old. There was no version of events in which I had opened an account with nearly $1,000, forgotten about it, and somehow failed to notice when it grew to $24 million. So someone else had opened it, in my name. And that thought was the one that finally made me sit up in bed at 3 a.m. and turn on the lamp and just breathe for a moment in the yellow light. Because I knew, not yet with proof, but with the deep cellular certainty of a woman who had spent 10 years quietly wondering why her divorce settlement had felt so hollow. I knew who it was. Derek. Let me tell you something about my marriage that I didn't fully understand while I was inside it. Derek Collins was a charming man. He was the kind of man who made everyone in a room feel noticed. He remembered your drink order, your kids' soccer schedule, the name of your elderly dog. He was warm and funny and socially effortless, and for a long time I mistook that for goodness. It wasn't goodness. It was a skill. And underneath the skill, there was a very different kind of man. One who had a profound and practiced talent for making things appear to be something other than what they were. Our divorce in 2014 had been my decision. I had been the one to finally pull the pin after 2 years of emotional distance so complete it felt like living with a well-dressed stranger. We had gone through mediation. Derek had presented financial documents. I had reviewed them myself, professionally, carefully, and the picture they painted was of a man of modest means, some shared debt, and no significant assets beyond our joint property. We sold the house. We divided the proceeds. I walked away with enough to buy a smaller house in Oak Park and a settlement that covered the kids' basic needs. I went back to full-time work. I rebuilt. And now I was sitting in my bedroom at 3 a.m., wondering if the entire financial picture he'd presented had been a lie. The next day, I called in a personal day and drove to the local branch of Great Lakes Federal Bank. I brought my passport, my social security card, and the old First Meridian envelope. The branch manager, a careful woman in her 50s named Patricia, confirmed that the account had indeed been opened in 2012, 2 years before my divorce, using my name and social security number. The initial deposit had been $847. The account had received a series of wire transfers over the following 2 years, totaling nearly $24 million. After 2014, no further deposits or withdrawals had been made. The account had simply sat there, waiting. "Who made those wire transfers?" I asked. Patricia looked at her screen for a long moment. "I can see the originating account numbers," she said, "but I'm not able to share that information directly with you today. You'd need to go through our legal compliance department or submit a formal records request." I thanked her and walked out into the parking lot. The wind off the lake was sharp and cold. I sat in my car and pressed my hands flat against the steering wheel. Fear. Yes, I felt fear. Real, physical fear. The kind that sits in your chest like a stone. Because if I was right, then I wasn't just dealing with a bad ex-husband. I was dealing with someone who had hidden $24 million using my identity during our marriage, who had clearly expected to retrieve it later, and who had somehow not gotten around to it, or not been able to, or perhaps had simply forgotten that the account existed in the same way he'd forgotten that I was still, legally, the named account holder. But here was the thing about fear. I had felt it before. I had felt it when I filed for divorce. I had felt it when I walked into my first day back at full-time work after 6 years of reduced hours. I had felt it every time I'd signed Tyler's school forms as a single parent and tried not to show him how tired I was. Fear was not new. Fear was, in fact, something I had considerable experience managing. So I sat in that parking lot and I let myself be afraid for exactly 15 minutes. I watched the clock on my dashboard, and when 15 minutes were up, I started thinking. First, I would say nothing to Derek, nothing to anyone in his orbit. My first instinct had been to confront him, and I recognized that instinct as the worst possible move. If he didn't know I'd found the account, and the bank's silence over the years suggested he might not have, then I had an enormous advantage. I would not give it up. Second, I needed a lawyer, not a general family attorney, a forensic financial attorney, someone who specialized in asset concealment and divorce fraud. I had worked in finance long enough to know a few names. I went home and made a list. Third, I needed documentation, everything. The old divorce papers, the financial disclosures Derek had submitted in 2014, the wire transfer records, once I could obtain them legally, a timeline, a paper trail so tight that no one could argue with it. I opened my laptop and started a new folder on my desktop. I named it something boring, Home Maintenance 2024, and inside that folder I began to build my case. The attorney I found was named Sandra Okafor. She had 20 years of experience in financial litigation, a particular specialty in post-divorce asset recovery, and an office on Michigan Avenue that looked expensive in the good way. Not showy, just precise. The kind of office where things got done. I found her through a colleague who had gone through a complicated divorce several years earlier and described Sandra as the most prepared person I've ever watched work. That was exactly what I needed. I called her on a Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, I was sitting across from her in a high-backed chair, sliding a manila folder across her desk. Inside, the First Meridian envelope, the conversation notes I'd typed up from my visit to Great Lakes Federal, my original divorce settlement agreement, and a 3-page timeline I'd assembled the night before. Sandra read everything without a word. She had the stillness of someone who'd trained herself not to react visibly to anything. When she finished, she set the papers down and folded her hands. "Ms. Collins," she said, "if the wire transfer records show what I think they're going to show, You may have one of the cleaner cases of marital asset concealment I've seen in quite some time. Is it recoverable? I asked. After 10 years? Illinois has no statute of limitations on divorce fraud when the concealment was active and deliberate, she said. 10 years doesn't protect him. It just means we have more documentation to gather. She paused. Are you prepared for this to become adversarial? Because when we file the formal records request and begin subpoena proceedings, Mr. Collins will find out. I had thought about this. I had thought about almost nothing else for the past 72 hours. Yes, I said, I'm prepared. Sandra filed the legal records request with Great Lakes Federal Bank the following week. I went back to my routine, work, home, phone calls with my kids, Sunday morning coffee, and tried to look like a woman whose life was perfectly ordinary. I was good at that. I had years of practice. It was during that waiting period, about 3 weeks after I'd retained Sandra, that I noticed the first sign that something had shifted on Derek's end. It was subtle. Tyler called me on a Tuesday evening, and within the first few minutes he mentioned, carefully, the way he always was when navigating between his parents, that his father had called him out of the blue that weekend, that Derek had been asking about you, Mom. Kinda weird. Like asking if you'd mentioned anything lately, if anything had changed. I kept my voice completely neutral. What did you tell him? That you seemed fine, same as always. Tyler paused. Is everything okay? Everything's fine, sweetheart, I said. I hung up and stood in my kitchen for a long moment. Derek was asking about me, after years of near silence. The timing was not a coincidence. Either he'd been tipped off somehow, a bank employee, a shared contact, or he'd had some reason of his own to check on the account recently and notice the legal records request attached to it. Either way, he knew something was moving, which meant I had less time than I'd hoped. I called Sandra the next morning. She told me the bank had received the subpoena and that she expected the transfer records within 2 to 3 weeks. We're close, she said. We were close, but so was he. The documents arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, delivered as a secure digital file to Sandra's office. She called me within the hour. I drove downtown and sat across from her again, and she walked me through what the bank records showed with the calm, methodical precision of a surgeon. The account had been opened in 2012 using my full name, my social security number, my date of birth, and a forged signature on the account application. A signature compared by the bank's own compliance team at Sandra's request to my actual signature on file, and found to be inconsistent. The initial deposit of $847 had been made in cash. Over the following 22 months, 17 wire transfers had been made into the account from 3 different LLCs, all registered in Delaware, all with names like MCF Holdings and Granite Bridge Consulting. Sandra had already run the incorporation records. All 3 companies had been registered with Derek Collins, listed as the sole managing member. $24 million, moved into an account in my name, without my knowledge, during our marriage. I looked at the documents for a long time. I felt something settle in my chest. Not calm, exactly. More like the particular stillness that comes after a long uncertainty ends, and you know, fully, irreversibly, that you were right. This is enough, I asked. This, Sandra said, sliding the folder across the desk, is more than enough. I signed the authorization for her to proceed with full litigation. As I wrote my name, my real name in my real handwriting, I thought about the forged signature on that 2012 account application. Someone had sat down and carefully copied the shape of my name, had practiced it maybe, had used it to build a financial fortress that they planned to walk into one day, leaving me with nothing. I thought about that, and I pressed the pen down a little harder. There was no going back now, and I didn't want to go back, not even a little. Sandra moved quickly. Within 2 weeks of my authorization, she had filed a formal motion to freeze the account pending litigation, submitted the forensic evidence package to the Cook County Circuit Court, and notified Derek's attorney, a man named Russell Hale, who Sandra described, without elaborating, as someone who prefers settlements to courtrooms, that we were proceeding. I went back to my daily life and waited. I told myself I was ready. I was not entirely ready for what happened next. It was a Thursday evening, 6 days after Sandra had notified Russell Hale. I was in my kitchen making pasta, phone on the counter, news on low in the background, when my cell phone rang. The number was Derek's. I had not spoken to him directly in almost 3 years. I looked at the phone through 2 full rings, then picked up. Maggie. His voice was the same as I remembered, warm, unhurried, the voice of a man who had never felt urgency because he had never needed to. We should talk. You can call Sandra Okafor, I said. She's my attorney of record. Everything goes through her. I'd rather talk to you directly. A pause. This doesn't have to be what you're making it. I'm not making it anything, I said. The documents are making it. There was a longer silence, and then the warmth dropped out of his voice like a switch being thrown. You need to think very carefully about what you're doing, he said. I have documentation that shows you knew about those accounts, that you agreed to the arrangement, that this was a mutual decision. My hand tightened on the phone. That's not true, I said. It doesn't matter if it's true, he said. It matters how it looks. And Maggie, I have people who will say what I need them to say. You know that about me. I did know that about him. That was perhaps the most honest thing he'd said to me in 20 years. Good night, Derek, I said, and hung up. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, the pasta boiling behind me, and let myself feel the full weight of what he'd just implied. He had fabricated evidence, or was prepared to fabricate it. He had people, attorneys, possibly former colleagues, maybe people whose names I knew from the years of our marriage, willing to provide false testimony. He was not going to simply let this go. 2 days later, it got worse. I came home from work to find a car in my driveway, a white Range Rover I recognized immediately as Tiffany's, Derek's wife. She was standing on my front porch. Tiffany was 38, blonde, impeccably dressed, and possessed of a particular type of confidence that came not from competence, but from years of being insulated from consequences. She smiled at me as I got out of my car, and the smile was the specific kind that doesn't reach the eyes. Maggie, she said, I thought we could have a woman-to-woman conversation. I stopped at the foot of my porch steps. You shouldn't be here. I just want to talk. She tilted her head. Derek is very upset. This whole thing. It's hurting the family. It's hurting your kids, whether you know it or not. Tyler and Dana. Do not say my children's names, I said. My voice was very quiet. She kept going. Derek has documented proof that you were aware of the financial arrangements during the marriage. If this goes to court, it's going to be your word against his. And you know Derek. He's very well regarded. He has a lot of friends, a lot of people who trust him. She paused. I'm asking you, woman to woman, to think about what a long, ugly court case does to your reputation, your career, your kids' lives. It was a threat dressed as concern. I recognized the costume. I had learned to recognize it during 15 years of marriage. You need to leave my property, I said. Now. Her smile didn't waver, but something behind her eyes changed. She left. I watched the white Range Rover back down my driveway and turn onto the street. Inside, I called Sandra and relayed everything. Derek's call, Tiffany's visit, the implication of fabricated testimony. Sandra told me to write it all down, time-stamped, and email it to her immediately. What he said about fabricated documentation, she said, that's potentially obstruction. Document everything. I documented everything. What happened over the following week was a controlled professional form of combat. Derek's attorney, Russell Hale, filed 2 motions attempting to delay the account freeze. Both denied. He submitted a character statement from a former business associate of Derek's, claiming I had expressed awareness of offshore financial arrangements during our marriage. Sandra shredded it in her response, noting that the associate had been a co-owner of one of Derek's Delaware LLCs and had a direct financial interest in the outcome. A second statement from a different associate met the same fate. The court upheld the account freeze. After that, the calls and the pressure stopped. Abruptly. The way pressure sometimes stops not because anything is resolved, but because the other side is regrouping. I took that weekend and the one after it to do almost nothing. I drove out to the Indiana Dunes on a Saturday alone and walked along the lakeshore for 2 hours. I called Dana and talked about her nursing program. I slept 9 hours 2 nights in a row, which I hadn't done in years. I let myself rest. The fight wasn't over. I knew that perfectly well. But I had held the line, and the account was frozen, and the evidence was in the hands of a court. And sometimes, between battles, you are allowed to just breathe. The offer arrived through Russell Hale, formally and in writing, on a Monday morning. Sandra forwarded it to me with a single line. "Call me when you've read this." I read it twice. Derek was proposing a private settlement. He would acknowledge that the account existed and that administrative irregularities had occurred in its creation. In exchange, I would receive $4 million. A clean wire transfer, no tax complications, handled quietly. And both parties would sign a mutual non-disclosure agreement and withdraw all current and future litigation. The account's remaining $20 million would revert to Derek's control. $4 million. That was the number he'd chosen. Enough to sound generous. Enough to make a tired, middle-aged woman think about paying off her mortgage, funding her kids' futures, never worrying about a car repair again. He'd calculated it precisely. He knew my finances. He probably knew, to the dollar, what $4 million would mean to the life I'd been living for the last decade. I called Sandra. "What do you think?" I asked, though I already knew what I thought. "I think," Sandra said carefully, "that it's your decision, and I will support whatever you decide. What I can tell you professionally is that his willingness to offer $4 million before we've even reached discovery tells me he's frightened. A man who is confident in his position doesn't offer $4 million to make a problem disappear." "He's frightened," I repeated. "I believe so." I was quiet for a moment. Outside my office window, Chicago was going about its business. Traffic, pedestrians, the gray gleam of late November sky. I thought about $4 million. I let myself think about it honestly, without guilt. I imagined paying off the Oak Park house. I imagined Dana finishing nursing school without loans. I imagined Tyler's face. And then I thought about the forged signature, about the 17 wire transfers, about the divorce mediation where Derek had sat across from me with his calm, warm face and told a mediator he had no significant assets, about the last 10 years, about the life I had built alone, on a salary, while $24 million sat in an account with my name on it. Tell him no, I said. I said it without anger, without drama. I said it the way you say something when you've already been certain for a long time and are just now putting the words in the air. Understood, Sandra said. I'll respond today. What followed was a strange, suspended period of about 2 weeks that I can only describe as a Cold War. Derek and Tiffany went quiet. No calls, no visits, no motions. Sandra told me Russell Hale had confirmed receipt of our rejection and that his client was considering options. I went to work. I came home. I cooked dinner. I raked the last of the leaves in my backyard. But I was not alone in this, and that was something I had not fully counted on when I'd started. The person who changed that was my friend Carolyn. Carolyn Webb had been my closest friend since we'd met at a parent-teacher night in 2008, two mothers sitting next to each other in plastic chairs, sharing a look of mutual exhaustion that had somehow turned into 16 years of friendship. She was a paralegal, divorced herself, with a dry humor and a complete inability to sugarcoat anything. I had finally told her everything the previous week, over 2 glasses of wine at her kitchen table. She had listened to the whole story without interrupting. Then she said, "You know what infuriates me most? He didn't even bother to use a different name. He used yours. He was that confident you'd never find it." That observation had lodged itself in me and hadn't left. Carolyn became my sounding board, my reality check, and my nerve steadier for everything that followed. When I started second-guessing myself at 2 a.m., I texted her and she texted back. When I needed to talk through the legal developments without it spilling into my professional life, she was the person I called. She had enough legal knowledge to understand what Sandra was doing, and enough personal loyalty to tell me, plainly, when I was being rational and when I was spiraling. One evening during that quiet fortnight, I asked her if she thought I was doing the right thing. She set down her coffee cup and looked at me for a moment. "Maggie," she said, "he used your name, your social security number, and your signature forged to hide $24 million while he sat across from you in a mediator's office and told them he had nothing. The right thing isn't even a question here." I nodded. "The only question," she continued, "is whether you're going to stay steady when he makes his next move. And he will make a next move. People like Derek always do." She was right. I knew she was right. The quiet felt like the held breath before something. I went home that night and slept well, for the first time in a while, not because everything was resolved, but because I finally felt, truly felt, that I was not standing alone. The call came on a Sunday. Derek's voice was different this time, quieter, with something in it I recognized from the early years of our marriage, something he deployed carefully and rarely, the sound of a man performing humility. "Maggie, I want to apologize," he said. "What happened with Tiffany coming to your house, that was wrong. I should have stopped her. I'm calling because I think we've let this get out of hand, and I'd like to talk. Just the two of us, civilly." I had been expecting this. The pressure had failed. The cash offer had failed. What came next in Derek's playbook, I knew, was the warm approach, the extended hand, the apparent step back. "We can meet," I said, "with both our attorneys present." "I was thinking more informal," he said. "Coffee, maybe, just to clear the air." "Attorneys present," I repeated, "or we don't meet." There was a pause. "All right," he said. "That works." We met 4 days later in a conference room at Sandra's office. Sandra, myself, Russell Hale, and Derek. Tiffany was not there, which I noted. Her absence felt deliberate, as if she'd been too volatile to risk bringing. Derek had dressed carefully for the occasion. dark gray, understated, the costume of a reasonable man. He smiled at me when I walked in, and the smile was the one I remembered from the good years. Warm, slightly self-deprecating, the smile of a man who was good at making people feel like he was on their side. He sat down and, for about 10 minutes, spoke about regret. He said that the financial decisions he'd made during our marriage had been wrong, that he'd been under enormous pressure from business partners, that he had always intended to, and here he paused carefully, properly account for everything. He said that the account had been opened with my information because his business associates had required a domestic account holder, and that he had believed, at the time, that he would be able to explain it all to me eventually. It was a masterful performance. He didn't admit fraud. He admitted poor judgment and poor communication. He painted a picture of a flawed but not criminal man, overwhelmed by circumstances, who had made mistakes but had never intended harm. I watched Sandra's face. She was unmoved. Russell Hale then presented what he described as a revised and improved settlement proposal. This time the number was $6 million, the same NDA, the same return of the remaining funds to Derek. I looked at the document for a moment. Then I looked at Derek, and I asked very quietly, "If the money was intended to be disclosed eventually, why did you forge my signature on the account application?" The warmth in his face didn't exactly vanish. It recalibrated. Something behind his eyes went flat. He looked at Russell Hale, who began to say something about the signature analysis being preliminary and contested, but I kept my gaze on Derek. "You sat in a mediator's office in 2014, I said, and told them you had no significant liquid assets. There were 17 wire transfers that say otherwise. There's a forged signature that says otherwise. I have been an accountant for 23 years. I understand what this documentation means." Silence in the room. Then something happened that I think Derek had not planned for and could not control. His composure broke, not completely, not theatrically, but in the particular way a facade breaks when its structural support gives out. His jaw tightened. His voice dropped. "You have no idea," he said, "what you're starting. You think you're the only one who can make things difficult. I built things during our marriage that you benefited from. I kept this family in a certain kind of life, and you—" He stopped himself, pressed his lips together, looked at the table. "Derek." Russell Hale's voice was careful, almost alarmed, but the mask had slipped. For about 10 seconds in that conference room, I saw the actual man behind the warmth and the gray suit and the performed regret. He was not frightened in the way weak people are frightened. He was frightened in the way powerful people are frightened when they suddenly realize the ground is moving. I stood up. "We're done for today," I said to Sandra. She nodded and began gathering papers. I walked out of that building and stood on Michigan Avenue in the November cold, and I felt it. The fear. Real, specific fear. Because for those 10 seconds, I had seen that Derek's anger was not bluster. He was the kind of man who followed through. He had proven that quietly for 15 years, and now he was frightened, which made him more dangerous, not less. But here was what I also felt, standing on that street. The fear was clarifying. It swept away the last traces of ambivalence, the last ghost of the woman who'd been married to him and had loved him once, and had wondered sometimes if perhaps she was overreacting. There was no ambivalence left. There was just a clear, cold line between where I was standing and where I needed to go. I texted Carolyn. He showed his face today, all the way in, no going back. Her reply came back in 30 seconds. Good. Now finish it." The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in early December, a case management conference before Judge Patricia Harmon of the Cook County Circuit Court, the first formal proceeding where both sides would present their positions on the core issue, whether the funds in the Great Lakes federal account constituted concealed marital assets subject to equitable redistribution under Illinois law. Sandra had told me what to expect. Derek's side would argue that the account represented business assets held in a complex structure that had been mutually understood, that the signature discrepancy was a clerical matter, and that the 10-year gap demonstrated my own lack of interest in the funds. Their position required them to maintain 3 things simultaneously, she said: that I had known about the account, that I had not known about the account, but had acquiesced to it, and that the account was a business instrument and not a marital asset. Those 3 arguments, Sandra said, are incompatible. We let them make all 3 and watch the structure collapse. I wore a dark blue suit to the hearing. Carolyn texted me a picture of a chess queen the morning of, no caption. The courtroom was not the grand wood-paneled room of films. It was a municipal courtroom, fluorescent lit, institutional beige, the American flag slightly crooked in its stand beside the bench. Judge Harmon was a compact woman in her early 60s with close-cropped silver hair and the specific patience of someone who had seen every conceivable variety of human dishonesty and was no longer particularly surprised by any of it. Derek was there with Russell Hale and a second attorney I hadn't seen before, a younger man who handled their financial exhibits. Tiffany was in the gallery. She was dressed expensively and sitting very still, with the calculated stillness of someone who has been told to make no expression. The proceedings began with each side's statement of position. Sandra went first. She walked through the chronology with quiet precision. The account opening in 2012, the forged signature, the 17 wire transfers from Derek's Delaware LLCs, the divorce mediation of 2014, in which Derek had certified under penalty of perjury that he held no significant undisclosed assets. That last part landed in the room with weight. Under penalty of perjury, Judge Harmon made a note. Then Russell Hale rose. And here is where the morning began to come apart for Derek's side. Hale argued first that I had been aware of the account, citing the statement from Derek's former business associate. The same statement Sandra had previously undermined by establishing the associate's financial interest. Judge Harmon asked a pointed question about that conflict of interest. Hale answered it, and his answer was not strong. Hale then argued that the account represented a business instrument, not a marital asset. Judge Harmon asked him to clarify how a personal account, opened using my Social Security number and bearing my forged signature, qualified as a business instrument rather than a personal account. Hale's answer involved approximately 90 seconds of legal language that, when it finished, had not actually answered the question. And then Hale argued, and this was the moment Sandra had predicted, that my decade of apparent non-engagement with the account demonstrated acquiescence to its structure. Judge Harmon looked up from her notes. "Counsel," she said, "your client's position is that Ms. Collins knew about this account, and also that Ms. Collins's failure to engage with the account indicates acceptance. Can you help me understand how both of those can be simultaneously true, given that the account was opened using a signature your own handwriting expert has now partially contested?" The room was very quiet. Hale began an answer. He got about 4 sentences in before the younger attorney leaned over and whispered something. Hale paused, regrouped, started again. It was, professionally, not a graceful moment. Derek beside him, was doing something I had never seen him do in 20 years of knowing him. He was sitting absolutely still, which sounds neutral, but was in fact the opposite of his natural bearing. Derek was a physical communicator. A hand on the arm, a lean forward, an expressive gesture. The stillness meant he was working very hard to contain something. Sandra rose for her rebuttal. She made 3 points, each one a sentence. She sat down. After the formal arguments, Judge Harmon ordered a full forensic accounting review of the wire transfer records, authorized an expanded subpoena for the Delaware LLC formation documents and their financial histories, and directed both parties to provide full financial disclosures within 30 days. She then looked at Russell Hale and said, "Counsel, I'll note for the record that the signature analysis and the perjury question on the 2014 mediation disclosure are items this court considers significant. I'd encourage your client to review his options carefully before the next hearing." That was a judicial understatement so precise it was almost elegant. In the corridor afterward, I passed Derek and Tiffany on my way out. He looked, for the first time since I'd known him, like a man who was genuinely unsure of what came next. Tiffany's face had lost its careful stillness and settled into something taut and unhappy. She said something to him in a low voice that I didn't catch, and he didn't respond. I walked out of the building and into the December cold. Sandra fell into step beside me. She said nothing for a moment, and then, "That went well." "Yes," I said. It did. I felt, standing on that street for the second time in a month, something different from before. Not fear, not even relief exactly. More like the particular silence after a very loud sound. The hearing had not been the end, but it had been the moment when the outcome became, if not certain, then legible. You could see the shape of it now, in the way you can sometimes see the shape of the land before you've finished crossing it. I called Carolyn from the parking garage. She picked up on the first ring. "How did it go?" "He couldn't hold all 3 arguments at once," I said. She laughed. It was a short, satisfied laugh. "Of course he couldn't," she said. "He's not actually that smart. He just played a long game with someone who wasn't watching." "I'm watching now," I said. "I know," she said. "I've known that for a while." The next 4 months were, in the language of litigation, a slow unwinding. The expanded subpoenas produced what Sandra had suspected they would. The 3 Delaware LLCs, MCF Holdings, Granite Bridge Consulting, and a third entity called Blue Shore Partners that we hadn't known about, had a combined history of financial activity that, once mapped chronologically, told a clear and damaging story. Blue Shore had received contracts during the years of our marriage from companies that Derek had claimed, in his divorce mediation disclosure, to have no ongoing relationship with. The LLCs had funneled income through several layers before the final deposits into the Great Lakes federal account. The structure was not, technically, simple, but it was not impenetrable either, and once Sandra's forensic accountant had finished mapping it, the picture was unmistakable. Derek had been concealing income and assets through a corporate layering scheme for at least 7 years before our divorce. The account, in my name, had been the final repository, a safe harbor he'd intended to access once the divorce was final and the dust had settled. He had not accessed it because, Sandra's theory went, his business circumstances had changed unexpectedly in 2015. Blue Shore Partners had been named in a separate civil dispute with a former client, and Derek had apparently decided to leave the account dormant rather than risk any scrutiny of an unexplained large transfer. And then time had passed, and the urgency had faded, and the account had simply sat there, growing a small amount of interest attached to my name, waiting. In March, Judge Harmon issued her ruling. She found that the funds in the Great Lakes federal account constituted marital assets that had been actively and deliberately concealed by Derek Collins during dissolution proceedings, that his 2014 financial certification had been materially false, and that the account balance plus applicable interest was to be distributed to me in full as the equitable settlement. She referred the matter of the falsified certification to the Cook County State's Attorney's Office for review. That was not something Sandra had asked for. The judge had done it on her own assessment of the record. She also awarded attorneys' fees, which was not a given in Illinois civil cases. It was a signal. The final number transferred to me after legal fees and the procedural costs of the freeze was $22,700,000. I was sitting in Sandra's conference room when the wire transfer was confirmed. Sandra turned her laptop screen toward me to show the confirmation notice. I looked at it for a moment. Then I looked up at her. "It's real," she said simply. I nodded. I want to be honest about what that moment felt like because I think people expect it to feel like a movie, like a crescendo, like something swells and the light changes. It didn't feel like that. It felt very quiet and very still and very tired in the good way. The way your body feels at the end of a long hike when you've reached the place you were going and you can stop walking. I had been walking for a long time. The walking was done. Derek did not fight the ruling. I was told through the attorneys that Russell Hale had advised him very strongly against it, given the state's attorney referral hanging over the proceedings. He had signed the transfer authorization without comment. I don't know what that felt like for him. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I didn't particularly want to know. What I did do, on the afternoon the transfer was confirmed, was drive to Carolyn's house. I let myself in with the key she'd given me years ago, found her in her kitchen making tea, and told her the final number. She set down her mug. She looked at me for a long moment. $22,700,000, she repeated. Yes. She sat down at the kitchen table, and I sat down across from her, and for about 30 seconds neither of us said anything. Then she reached across the table and took my hand. "Maggie," she said, "you did it." I had done it. Not with drama, not with a speech, not with confrontation in a hallway or a satisfying verbal takedown or any of the clean cinematic moments that I'd half imagined in the dark at 3 a.m. I had done it the way I had done most things in my life, with documents and preparation and the refusal to be moved by pressure or money or the performative warmth of a man who had counted on me not looking closely enough. He'd been wrong about that. He had been wrong about me from the beginning. I did not do anything extravagant with the money right away. The first thing I did was pay off the Oak Park house. I drove to the bank, processed the payoff, and sat in the parking lot with the confirmation paperwork in my hands. The house had been the one solid thing in my life for 10 years. Now it was fully mine. That was the right first step. The second thing I did was set up educational trusts for Tyler and Dana, enough to erase their student loans, fund graduate studies if they wanted them, and give them a foundation they'd never have to worry about. I called each of them separately and told them there had been a legal settlement and that their financial futures were secured. Tyler was quiet for a long moment and then said, "Mom, are you okay?" I told him I was better than I'd been in years. Dana cried a little, which made me cry, and then we both laughed at ourselves. Third, I paid off the last 3 years of Carolyn's mortgage. I didn't tell her in advance. I processed it and then called her and told her it was done. "Maggie, you can't—" "It's done," I said. "Don't argue with me about it." She didn't argue. She cried instead, which was so unlike her that it made me cry again for the second time in a week. I was doing a lot of crying that month. It was, I had decided, acceptable. I left my firm in the spring, gave full notice, completed everything in process, and left on good terms. I took 3 months off and did almost nothing. I walked. I read. I drove out to the Indiana dunes twice more. I visited Dana and Tyler and stayed with each of them for a long weekend. We ate dinners together and talked about their lives, and I sat with the particular quiet luxury of being fully present without the low background hum of financial anxiety that had accompanied me, like tinnitus, for the better part of a decade. In the fall, I started a small financial consulting practice, working with individuals navigating divorce and asset division, the kind of careful, documentation-focused work I was already good at, now done entirely on my own terms. The work was meaningful. The hours were my own. As for Derek, the state's attorney's review resulted in a criminal perjury charge for his 2014 mediation certification. He pleaded guilty to a reduced charge and received 2 years probation, a substantial fine, and a permanent notation on his professional record. He lost 2 consulting contracts when the case received coverage in a local business publication. His professional reputation, his most carefully maintained asset, never fully recovered. Tiffany filed for divorce from Derek 14 months after the civil ruling. I don't know the details, and I didn't look for them. What happened between them was not my story. The Scottsdale vacation home was sold as part of Derek's financial restructuring. I heard through Tyler that Derek had moved to a smaller apartment in the suburbs. I received it without comment. I did not feel satisfaction at his diminishment. What I felt was something closer to distance, the peaceful distance you feel when something that once had enormous power over your life has simply receded to the point where it no longer occupies space in you. He had taken 10 years from me. He had taken the fair settlement I deserved. He had taken the version of the future I might have had. He had not, it turned out, taken everything. I was sitting on my back porch one evening in October, a year after finding that envelope in the shoebox, watching the late sun come through the oak tree in my yard. The leaves were turning. The light was golden. My coffee was warm. I had nowhere to be. I thought about the woman who had made that phone call 12 months earlier. How afraid she had been, how tired, and how quietly certain, somewhere under all of it, that there was something that needed to be faced. I was glad she had faced it,